Uh, and I don't know, it will not do him justice to try and tell all that he has done. It will be enough if we say that he did his PhD at MIT under later Nobel Prize winner Dan McFadden, and at that time he was interested in what McFadden was interested in, i.e. Regional things and stuff like that. But in many years, he is now a specialist in the issue of pensions, and he really knows a lot about pensions. It's unbelievable. I mean, we had a discussion when he visited here, and it's unbelievable how much he knows, what the combination that he can combine details and the big picture, and the interesting views that he has. I would say not conservative, but very pragmatic on the one hand and revolutionary on the other hand. So now we hear that he's doing what, in fact, we are doing here, i.e. talk to psychologists and try to have the psychologist input into the issue of pensions. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Professor Axel Boersch-Supan. Thank you.
Thanks, Avia, for the nice words. I really enjoyed the week we had in Israel, and it seems like yesterday. And we really felt in the middle of Israel. As Aviat already said, to the right and to the left there were demonstrations, and we traveled to the north and traveled to the south. It was just a very good time. So I want to speak. Let me just share my screen. Okay, do you see the full screen? No?
We can see two slides. We can see the slides in the slide.
Is that better?
Yeah, now it's better. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So I want to talk about pension policy and saving regret. Sorry about the typo right in the middle. And these are actually two presentations, two separate presentations. And I sort of merged them because I think that fits nicely the topics of the Ben-Gurion University's Pension Institute. So let me start with a picture which is fairly old, and I have shown already before, actually in Beersheba, quite a while ago. It shows the assets in pension funds, and you see Israel at the right hand and Germany at the left hand. And these two countries couldn't be more different. You see Israel by now probably has about 150% of GDP in terms of asset, and Germany barely 10. Israel has very much depended on funded pensions, on saving by plans, voluntary, whereas Germany has a pay-as-you-go system, which is mandatory, and everybody's enrolled. If I had given this talk in the 90s, I would, particularly being in Germany at that time, just coming back from the United States, I would have said, well, Germany, you really need to have more saving. I slowly changed my mind. I think Germany does something wrong by having too little assets in pension funds. But Israel also has created problems by relying exclusively on, or almost exclusively, on state pensions. And to give you some background why I think so, I actually refer to a paper which is relates to saving regret. Now, why do I do this? I think a rational pension system should have three pillars, if you want, parts, elements. It needs some kind of means-tested base pension just to prevent poverty in old age. And almost all countries have that, more or less generous. In Switzerland and in the Netherlands, these are the first two. Can you see my mouse? Flags here. It's fairly generous. In Israel, it's not so generous. In Germany, somewhere in between. But then it also, I think it needs a pay-as-you-go pillar. They can be very large in some countries. In Israel, it's almost non-existent. But also a fully funded pillar, and that in Germany is almost non-existent for various reasons I will talk about, whereas it's very strong in Israel and in the UK and Sweden and in the United States. The psychological background why I sort of shifted my opinion and think that relying almost exclusively on the fully funded pillar comes from what I'll call saving regret. And we have written a paper, it's not out yet, where we compare the US, Singapore, and Europe. And what we see is the failures of individual planning. But they're very different, these failures. And my story is that the differences are due to the different background welfare systems. This is a paper together with a former student of mine, Tabea, Mike Hurt, fairly well-known economist on savings behavior and retirement behavior, Susan Roveda, which happens to be his wife, and Luca Zalano, who's a student currently here in Munich. Okay. So the big question is, do people undersave for old age? And there's a lot of evidence and moaning about it. I quote some papers here. Ironically, my name is among them, but I also have a paper that people oversave for old age. That is a bit in the tradition of Japanese and Italian, and there's no contradiction because some people undersave, some people oversave, and it's good to really understand what's going on there. So I'm actually interested in what people think, whether they oversaved or undersaved. So I'm not. It's a very untypical approach for economists who usually look at saving data from some accounts or surveys, then judge whether that is oversaving or undersaving. Here, I'm just asking the people. And then we get people who say that in hindsight, they actually regret or not having sufficiently saved in their lifetimes. So these are people age 50 and over, and the question is, if you look back, do you regret? Do you think you have undersaved or oversaved? That we call saving regret. Why am I interested? If you do pension policy, you usually have a tendency to be paternalistic. Actually, the entire reason to have a pension system is based on paternalism, because we think that people are myopic. They don't really look forward enough. So we intervene and actually make them safe in a funded system or contribute to a pay-as-you-go system. The mandatory part is the crucial one. And I think saving regret is not sufficient, but in any case, a necessary piece to impose paternalism, to force people into a saving system or to nudge them into a saving system. So that's the sort of policy background. There are many reasons why people may regret that they haven't saved enough. There are also a few who say they have saved too much. One is procrastination. And this is actually the most fashionable kind of explanation. Where psychologists and economists meet, usually they talk about procrastination, meaning that you are willing to save, but please not today. You do it tomorrow. And tomorrow, same thing, right? And so day after day, year after year, and suddenly you're age 70 and you ended up not having saved enough. That's the very idea. Some people have become famous on work on procrastination. David Leibson is a good example. But there are other reasons. There could be unanticipated shocks. And almost everybody of us has had unanticipated shocks, be it unemployment, be it a health shock, be it a divorce. And if you ask people about probability of unemployment or a health shock or a divorce at young ages, they completely underestimate the probability that this happens. And very often you hear, it won't happen to me. So there is some overconfidence, but also just not enough knowledge about the frequency of unemployment, the frequency of bad health, and lo and behold, the frequency of divorce. I actually don't know the numbers in Israel, but in Germany, it's relatively low for European standards, meaning that a third of every marriage gets divorced. In Sweden, it's about half, and in the United States, it's also higher. Then there are shocks at the macro level. We just had a few, right? The financial crisis, COVID-19, Ukraine, which bites and just kills the best saving plan you had if you didn't think about these. Then there's knowledge. People just didn't learn about Social Security, pension benefits, how to save, different asset classes. Then there's computational ability. Actually, it's not that easy to think about how much you should save. And that should be correlated with cognition and numeracy. But in any case, it's difficult. Most people don't understand compound interest and that time plays such a big role. And the third, the last one here, number 6 on the bullets here, is just cheap talk. After the fact, when people didn't save enough, they say, "Well, had I known better," and it's just a cheap excuse for not having done anything. So the trick of the paper is to try to separate these causes because they have different policy implications. If it's procrastination, well, more or less you have to force people to save, right? If it's unanticipated shocks, well, then maybe financial education will help or general education. Tell people, not exactly on the day of marriage, but a few days later that divorce probabilities are high and that you have to think about it. Shocks at the macro level, they happen. And in history classes, one should speak more about these shocks. Pandemics, for example. I actually did not really take pandemics seriously when I was thinking about shocks, and then COVID-19 came. And then I learned about the Spanish flu and how many people actually died in the Spanish flu. That was not an item I knew about. Well, in Israel, you know that wars happen. You had a fair share of them. We have forgotten about them. We dismantled our army in Germany. Now we have to rebuild it. We forgot about wars. And so forth. That can be taught. Financial information for knowledge, computational ability to teach people better. And if it's only cheap talk, then we shouldn't take it serious. So it's very, very different policy impact. Insurance is an important thing. If people are not able to really understand the system, if they procrastinate, if they can't calculate the probability of shocks, social insurance is a good institution where people are, and they can rely, at least to some insurance, to some degree, on that insurance, be it a state-run insurance or a social insurance which is somewhat away from the state. If decision-making is really such a big problem, as many people think of us these days, then having a stress-benevolent state, which actually takes care by an insurance system, may be a good policy. And Social Security, in the American sense, but also in the European sense, may be a good thing. Okay, we collected data in the United States. I don't want to go into details. It's a sample of somewhat short of 2,000 people. We have a similar survey in Singapore, actually, which is almost a copy of the American one, with a much larger sample. Well, being the head of the Survey of Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe, I put some of the most important questions about survey regret into share, and that includes quite a lot of countries, large sample. In each country, however, it's small. So, for example, you see Israel, 544 people. We ask about saving regret. You can't do too much with that. But if we think that people in Europe and Israel think somewhat comparably, then it's actually a fairly large sample. Okay. Now, the point of having these three is they have very different welfare systems. There is the European countries in share. Israel is an exception. There are a few other exceptions. Have pay-as-you-go pension systems, but they all have mandatory pension systems. Whereas in the US, Social Security is mandatory, but it's relatively you don't get a high pension from it. So people are relying on occupational pensions and private saving accounts. Singapore has a very, very overarching saving system, so-called Provident Fund, and I call it overarching because it includes housing, it includes health insurance, long-term care insurance, and pensions. And you can use the money for all the four purposes. It's a mandatory system, and you're allowed to use all your money, saving money for housing, as long as you try, I'm careful here, to have enough money for the pensions when you're older. So the idea is you borrow against your own assets, you buy housing, and sort of around the age of 50, you start paying it back, so you have enough funds left over at age 65 when you go into retirement. That's the idea of the Singaporean system. Okay. Now, the key question we have on saving regret is, please think back when you were around 45 years old. Suppose you could redo your spending and saving from then on. Would you save more over the years, about the same or less? We have another version, which is a little bit more explicit, because we say if you save more over the years, then you have to spend less, or the other way around. So it's more of a we help to think the people a little bit more that saving is that means consuming less. And we randomize who gets which. We really try to push the people to think hard. So if they say, yes, I would have liked to save more, then we ask, well, which of these spending categories you could have possibly spent less? And then we talk about housing, food, clothing, appliances, car, vacation, children's education, all the kind of stuff. And then some people say, oh no, if I now think about it, there was no way I could have cut spending. I changed my mind and I did the right thing. And then we push them once more and say, well, even if you could have done it, would you have wished to have done it and spent less? And again, we go through the same litany: housing, food, clothing, appliances, car, vacation, children's education, and so forth. And again, some people say, well, no, I wouldn't have wished it. And don't laugh, but if you look at males, then they think they have spent too much on cars. And if we ask women, well, guess what it was? So prejudicial. So I won't even tell. And about quite a few actually revised. And you see in the United States, the proportion of people who wish to have saved more is 66%, but after the revision possibilities is only 54%. But it's still more than a half. And that is one of the main messages. Very few would have saved less. The majority actually wish to have saved more. In Singapore, this is somewhat less. There's again revision, but it's about 10% less. The astounding difference is in Europe. If you look at that, it's a very small percentage. Most actually says, well, it was okay. And the amount of the share of people who would have liked to save less is actually considerably higher than in the United States. So very, very different outcomes. And the question is why? And whoops. So we actually look whether it sort of has expected patterns and more or less it reflects the folklore you would think of. Younger people tend to have more regret than older people. Older people know what they have done, but they're satisfied, come to rest and peace with themselves. And you see that married people are more confident that they did the right thing than unmarried people. More interesting is education. It goes down with education. It goes down with wealth, predictably, and also with income. So these obvious kind of correlations, which you would expect, are actually there in all the countries, stronger. If we go deeper in the causes, you'll remember this litany. You have seen these points before. We look at financial knowledge, and it strongly actually correlates with that. People with very low financial knowledge have much higher saving regret in the United States. If you look at cognition or numeracy, you find a funny U-shape, which I interpret that those who have low cognition or numeracy do the wrong thing, but those who believe they know everything, they are overconfident. So that creates this U-shaped, inverse U-shaped pattern. Procrastination. So this was really in some sense, the hot question. And here you see various scales for procrastination. There's actually a quote unquote official procrastination scale, some of these items, and we were extremely disappointed that we did not really find a convincing pattern. There are patterns here and there, but mostly it's relatively flat or goes the wrong way or is not monotonous. That was a big surprise. We used various scales. We always got the same results. We used the Big Five for any kind of psychological measures in the share data, and there are no convincing correlations. Okay. So that is one of the few straight patterns among the sea of inconsistent patterns. Then we looked at shocks, and the question is, sometimes people have negative surprises early in life that cause their finances to turn out worse than expected, and then we ask a long set of potential surprises. We also do the same for positive surprises. I think it's a number of about 12 shocks which we name, and here we just count the negative shocks, and there's a clear correlation, actually very strong in terms of statistical significance. The people with more shocks have a higher tendency to regret saving. In the US and also in Europe, it's very pronounced. Less so in the higher numbers in Singapore. Now, if we look at the specific shocks, then you see that the negative shocks are almost all highly significant, and you can see the kind of shocks. Unemployment, divorce, separation, and the positive shock, sort of the only one which are really convincing, is that they received an inheritance. This is at the bottom here, and the other one is that they spent less, particularly in Europe and in Singapore. So shocks are important. If you do a variance composition, let me actually go a little bit further. What we did is we put all the potential causes in a regression, and then look at the explanatory power for the kind of groups of variables which could explain it. The psychometric variables, which are at least correlated with procrastination, the shock variables, and of course wealth and these kind of things, personal characteristics. You see that we have, if you look at the R square, then you see that it explains very little. Disappointingly little, in spite of the significant results. For example, all these variables together are highly significant, as in an F test. The shocks are significant. The overall explained variance is relatively low, and we also put country dummies into to proxy for the welfare systems, and what we really think is that, let me go back here and explain a little bit better. The country dummies are hard, as always, to interpret in detail. But if you think about the welfare system, then the Social Security system in the US is relatively small. The tax rate is 12%. In Italy, it's 3 times as much. In France, a little bit less, but even in Germany, it's about twice as much. There's no universal health insurance in the United States, and there's no universal social assistance system. So you can get very poor because there is no poverty prevention method. Public pension spending is about 20% of GDP, which is not that small, but much smaller than in the European countries. In Singapore, you have the Central Provident Fund, which I explained earlier. The contribution rate is actually huge, almost 40%. 20% of that goes to housing. And what is well known is that this housing is a huge temptation for the Singaporeans. So they actually buy housing, promise to pay the part of the housing back, but never do it. And then they run out of funds in retirement and healthcare. If they have something left in old age, it almost all goes to the healthcare, and they're relatively poor in retirement. That explains part why Singapore has such high saving regret. Now, Europe, most of Europe, has mandatory public pension plans. And even though they're expensive, the contribution rates are high. They do their job. It's very hard in Germany to get poor in old age. It's less than 3%. Very different from Israel, very different from the United States. They also, most of the countries have universal health insurance, which has a broad coverage. And about half of the European countries has a mandatory long-term care insurance. So also long-term care is covered by social insurance. And all countries in Europe have social assistance. So if you think the poverty line is the social assistance line, then you can never fall below. But some countries' social assistance is meager, including Germany. Much better than in Israel, but still, it's rock bottom. So we explained that this, we believe that this explains very much saving regret differences between the 3 countries, but this is more suggestive evidence than hard evidence. Okay. If we look specifically and compare the countries, then you also see a clear pattern here. This is before and after revision. You actually see that Israel is pretty high up. Also Greece, which is rebuilding its social security system after it broke down in the financial crisis. And you see that countries which have a very large social security system, like Italy or Austria, particularly Austria, have much lower prevalence of saving regrets. Germany somewhere in the middle. So all this is suggestive that welfare state is. Now, what we do right now is in the share data, we actually look at individual, because there is also within countries variation in the social security systems. Some have a more social, more universal coverage than others within each country. And we hope we get some hard evidence on that the people who are covered better have less regret. If you do a macro regression, you see a positive correlation, but it's lousily small. It's not really convincing. So that's why we go into micro data here. And this is work which we do. So my conclusions are there's convincing evidence that people regret and that there is undersaving. That's a fact, right? And it's important to have evidence on that fact. I think there's too much hype about procrastination. It seems to be much more, the other things seem to be more important. In addition to procrastination, there are other dimensions of, let's call it human error or human insufficient thinking. So the seriously underestimated probability of negative shocks. And these shocks happen throughout the entire life, shocks. And we think that the welfare state protection makes a big difference across countries, across welfare state systems. And that gets me back to the pension system. Now I look on my watch. You have seen that before. And now you probably guess in which direction my thinking goes. So I like to call this rational system design. If you were a designer of a new pension system, what, I'm hesitating here, should you do? And so it's a very very kind of normative approach here. So I think it's really important to prevent poverty in old age. You need something so people don't fall below the cracks. And the only way to do this is with a means-tested system, which is paid by tax money. What sort of the level is until you support people, that is a political question. But you want to avoid that people get into starvation. Most countries have found out a reasonable basis here. As much as I know, also Israel has changed its policy and has introduced such a base pillar. There are some people who give the base pillar to everybody, and then you can top it off. Other people give that only to people who are in need, the means testing. There are differences, but this is fine print. I'm also very eager in talking first about this base pillar before I talk about pay-as-you-go pension reforms or fully funded pension pillar reforms. Because in times of demographic aging, these reforms invariably mean less services, a lower replacement rate. And that hurts the poor people more than the rich people. And an argument which I always get if I don't stress the prevent poverty thing first is that we create poverty by making pension systems less generous for the middle class. That's why I want to rule this out before. Okay, now all European countries are heavily aging, the United States also. Singapore is aging at a very quick path from a low level, but also Israel is aging. And the usual things which have to be done in designing a pay-as-you-go system is think about the retirement age. There has to be a minimum retirement age in a pay-as-you-go system, unlike in a fully funded system. You have to think about the replacement rate. And I'm very, very fond of having an automatic retirement age adjustment, which indexes the retirement age to life expectancy. So if we live longer, we have to work longer, but we can also a little bit be longer in retirement, but that has to be financed. So there's no way we can escape increasing the retirement age. And the more automatic that is, the easier it can be done. The hard step is really introducing such an automatic adjustment. It has been done in Norway very early on and in other countries, also in the private system in France. I tried to introduce that in Germany and I failed. Pretty much the same as in France. If you ask about an increase in the retirement age, people go onto the streets. What has worked just to make it a little bit more concrete, the life experience tells you that you need about 2 years to work to finance 1 year in retirement. Actually, in a lifetime, you work about 40 years and you are about 20 years in retirement, and 20 years you go to school. That makes 80 years, very rough. But it tells you that a dynamic retirement rule would be 2 to 1. If you live 3 years longer, then you can have 1 more year of retirement, but you also have to work for 2 more years. Examples are the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and the private sector of France. The other thing is if you need to design a system which survives the population aging, you have to somehow fiddle with a replacement rate in comparison to the contribution rate. Now, again, there is a slide here. The basic budget constraint of a pay-as-you-go system is this one here. The revenues are proportional to the number of young people times the contribution rate, and the expenditures are the replacement rate times the number of pensioners. And if you want to balance the budget, then you see that population aging, which increases the number of pensioners relative to the number of workers, either forces you to increase the contribution rate or to decrease the replacement rate. And what you really want to do is both. You want to have a sort of an equiproportional increase of the contribution rate and an equiproportional decrease of the replacement rate, so that both generations actually bear some of the burden of demographic change. That's a very nice indexation rule, which essentially indexes the generosity of the pension system to the old age dependency ratio. That has been installed in Germany, in Spain, and some other countries. But in Germany, it has been deinstalled because people want to have a constant. No, because why? Because we have a pretty old populace. There are about twice as many voters age 50 and over as there are voters 50 and below. Now, the 50 and below hate to have an increased contribution rate. The old people hate to have a reduced replacement rate. If they have the majority versus them, then the contribution rate will go up. And the replacement rate will be fixed. And exactly that is the policy which has been installed in Germany. We now have a fixed replacement rate, and the contribution rate increases and increases and increases to the detriment of the younger people, but in favor of the older people. So that's another failure. I'm telling you the first failure of mine, which was to convince the German government to increase the retirement age. My second failure was to fail to keep the indexing to the system dependency ratio, which was introduced 20 years ago in Germany. Okay, let me go and finish with the fully funded pillars. There are 2 different ways to have funded pillars. One is mandatory via occupational pensions, or Sweden actually has a state mandatory funded pillar. The United States and Germany has introduced voluntary savings. Now, about the voluntary saving, I already told you in the saving regret research we did, that didn't really work out. Too few people actually saved, and we have what I call saving regret. With the mandatory saving, it depends how it's organized. So in Sweden, automatically part of your salary goes into the funded system, and then the funded system is invested by a private company with relatively high returns. That works kind of well, but it took 40 years to build up. In other countries, it depends on your job. And that's the case in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, and also in Israel, where the generosity of the fully funded system depends on the occupation you're in. Also, some people are not covered by occupational pensions, and they fall between the cracks. Now, the UK actually has tried to combine sort of the best of all worlds by nudging people, by first forcing all employers to offer a occupational pension, even if they have only one person to work with. If that doesn't really work out for financial reasons, then the state marches in and covers these. In principle, the employees are voluntary enrolled, but they first are automatically enrolled in. And if they don't want, then they have to make a firm decision to get out of the pension system. And the way to do this actually is a little complicated. So that is a, if you want, nasty way to nudge people into the system, and it works pretty well. So there are very few people who voluntarily opt out, and these people are mostly rich and have other means, private savings. So it's not really a social problem. The problem in some of the fully funded pillars is how the money is invested. Unfortunately, I know very little about the Israeli system here, but it has worked very well in the Netherlands, also in Sweden. It has worked disastrously in Singapore at times, where the returns were negative. It also has worked out horribly in Germany, where the so-called Riester pensions, voluntary IRA-like pensions, like the American system, have been extremely costly. So even if they were invested quite in a good way, the entire system has been very costly. And this is because the individual pension systems, where individuals actually select among a large number of funds, that looks very nice in terms of individual decision making, but it is a very costly system, because beside the social security system or the employee record system, which every employer has you build up a third system of administrating pensions. And building up these administrative systems is rather expensive. So I changed my mind from 20 years ago or 30 years ago, from voluntary pension systems, individual pension systems. They're way too expensive. Pension systems need large numbers of an organization. Just from a very bureaucratic point of view, it's best if they're run, if the administration is either run by an occupational system, but not by single employers, but by a super organization of employers, like entire sectors, or the state. The state collects the money, and there is no gain in competition in the administration of a pension system. There's a lot of gain from competition in investing the money to actually get the highest rate of return. Again, from a rational system design point of view, fully funded pillars need a super organization which uses the economies of scale, and then a fairly complicated competitive system to actually invest the funds. Okay, I think that's what I want to talk about. Funded pillars are nice, but they need to be because they're self-balancing and they create macroeconomic growth. And I think for Israel, that has worked to some extent. They have fostered macroeconomic growth and sort of the financing of what you are well known for, spin-offs, very highly productive, inventive small companies. That has been fostered by the funded pillars. But there are also serious problems. They cannot address the poor. They just cannot. Markets have failed to weed out costly pension plans in many countries. There are examples for very bad asset allocation. Singapore is a case in point. And if it depends on people, on individuals with a lack of information, then you get saving regret. So I think in addition to funded pillars and a base pillar to prevent old age poverty, you also need a pay-as-you-go earnings-related system as a foundation for the middle class. The rich people, you don't have to worry. The poor people are covered by the base pension. But for the middle class, you need something in addition to the fully funded pillars. Yeah, thank you very much for your patience. And I'm happy to discuss.
Okay, thank you very much for a very inspiring lecture and a lot of knowledge, as I promised beforehand. I think that if we can get from the audience a few questions that might enliven the whole thing and maybe clarify some points that any questions, ladies?
I had several questions, if that was okay.
You have a question, okay.
Yes.
Just tell us your name and the affiliation, just.
My name is I'm Reuven Mandel, and I work at the Reshut Shuk HaHon as an actuary overseeing the pension funds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I was just curious what you were in that second of the three pillars, what you were referencing when you said a pay-go system. I mean, I recognize typically either, let's say, a social security system, which would be pay-go, or, for example, government workers' pension funds in the US, which would be pay-go, that they're not funded, but that's similar to an employer fund, just happens to be that the government has unlimited pockets. So what were you referencing when you said that doesn't exist?
No, I'm referring the United States pension system is a good example, but it's relatively small. If you look at countries like Italy, France, or Germany, then the pay-as-you-go system is much larger and covers essentially the lower middle class, and quite generously so. So in France, you have a replacement rate which is pretty much 100%.
And that's sponsored by taxes, not by employers?
There are independent organizations, more or less independent organizations. But since pensions are always a political issue, they are somewhat connected with the ministries of labor. But the the US Social Security is the closest to the government. Whereas, for example, in Germany, government funds and Social Security funds are completely different. And that's also why they don't have infinite pockets. By the way, I also do not believe that the government has infinite pockets, as we just see.
No, but
so
sometimes
that is why
why
the European pay-as-you-go systems need reform in terms of pension.
And then just to clarify, who's bearing the risk in those pay-as-you-go systems? Is it the next generation having enough workers to cover the prior generation's retirees?
Yeah, it's essentially the risk are the basic risk are demographic risks, and if you fix the contribution rate, then the risk is borne by the older generation. If you fix the replacement rate, then the risk is borne by the younger generation. And that is why I advocate sort of a risk sharing between the two generations in indexing pension generosity to the system dependency ratio.
Okay, I just want to mention one point, if that's okay, with regards to the differing retirement ages. Is a year and a half ago when Israel did change the retirement age for a woman to begin to increase. They initially had in the law that beyond a certain point it would actually be a function of the life expectancy, and that ultimately was taken out, but that was bandied about.
Okay. We've got a lot of people that are senior
I can't ask.
workers at some high places. Yafit, would you like to ask something? Yafit Bar, would you like to ask something?
Sorry, I didn't hear all the. I started at the end of the election, so I'm sorry. But I would like to hear the other questions.
Okay.
Yes, we have Shmuel Yerushalmi who also left a comment in the chat. Shmuel, you can ask your question. I think he's stuck. I think he's stuck right now.
You hear me? Okay, I want to ask you what what according to you will be impacts of increasing anti-social and neoliberal policy in the world on the future of pension policy, and firstly in the states of Singapore and the different welfare countries of the Western Europe. Thank you.
I'm not really sure I understood the question. There are we have in Europe many different kind of realizations. First of the pay-as-you-go system, and second about the sort of division of labor between the pay-as-you-go system and the funded system. Now, let me actually come back to, which was a little bit alluded to by the previous question. If you think about social risk and minimizing social risk in old age provision, then you actually want to have a mixture of a pay-as-you-go and a fully funded system. The main risk in a pay-as-you-go system is demography, population aging, and the main risk of the fully funded systems is misuse of funds, low rate of return, or just a huge crisis, high inflation, financial crisis. And as we all know, combining two risky systems reduces the total system risk. So just for a risk diversification, you really want to have a mixed system and not a pure pay-as-you-go or a pure fully funded system. Some countries actually achieved a fairly balanced system. And I think the most well-known is the Netherlands, where it's about 50-50. Denmark, whereas the United States has a mixture which is along the income distribution. So the poor people only have pay-as-you-go Social Security, whereas the rich people essentially have only fully funded money. Now, in Europe, you find all combinations. And you find also all combinations of pension reforms, successfully changing the retirement age, unsuccessfully doing so, like Emmanuel Macron, it's unclear. You find indexation rules, automatic rules. You find countries with a lot of discretionary pension policy. And so it's very interesting to see that specter. I would say Israel is in one corner of the pension systems, in the spectrum of pension systems, relying so heavily on occupational pension funds.
I think that maybe David Laser, the psychologist, may have something to ask or add to the discussion. David?
About the psychological aspects, we recently completed a large study trying to analyze what is really striking. And we also found that procrastination is not nearly as important as would otherwise have been thought. There are a number of additional aspects which are not included in the big five. Well, about the big five, conscientiousness has always been found to be extremely important, but it's also the psychological impact may depend on the system. So in particular, if you consider your self-image as somebody who understands what you call numeracy, but like I'm not talking about the actual knowledge, although they may be correlated, will be correlated, but the self-image you have about how much you understand this. In other words, when you see an Excel table, you go a little blank. This has a very big impact in such places where it's really important to understand what goes on. On some system, you don't really have to follow. That would be one example. I don't have the data in front of me. I'm trying to remember another trait. Oh yes, that was attention. Like what's called executive functions. And we know it often under the name of attention deficit disorder. We're not talking about disorder, but about a capability of sticking to something, thinking about it through and so forth. That is very important in those systems where a lot of weight is put on the people themselves. And I believe these are important psychological traits which are not usually recognized, but turn out to be massively important. And procrastination, I agree, it's not what it's touted to be. In general, I would say that an interesting topic of study would be to look at economists' views of psychological traits, because I believe these are seriously distorted for various reasons.
Okay.
No, David, I very much agree. Particularly in the US, you need financial knowledge to get through your life, and that puts a lot of people at a disadvantage for various kinds of psychological traits. That's why, at least for the base system, including the major part of the middle class, you need a robust system where people don't have to make decisions which they later regret. That is paternalistic. That is also why I sort of apologized in the very beginning for it. But if you think that pension systems are required, then you already did the big first step. And then you can also go and design it in a way where people are led to a good outcome.
Yes, I believe when we had a conference a few months ago, much stress was put on what you also flagged, namely that the system in Israel does not work well for poor people. It works well in many ways, including in developing the finances of the financial system in the country. It works well for middle class and richer people, and it leaves the poor people behind, and they may actually regret having saved what they did. But we also have to think about people who are otherwise disadvantaged, not only poor people, but people who just happen not to have the right set of cognitive skills to function well with a given system. And when designing a system, we have to be aware of. It's just not fair. If you happen to be not the right kind of person, then you won't make it. That's unfair.
There is the question of financial education, and there is a lot out to teach people how to think in financial terms.
It's not.
My impression is it doesn't work.
It doesn't work,
Yeah.
but it's not just a matter of education. It's also if you don't have the right kind of personality, if you are, well, let's say you live your life and you enjoy it, or you struggle with whatever the fate is throwing at you, but you are not just the kind of person who is orderly and comfortable with numbers and willing to push through in your life and so forth. Those features are also important for helping you make more money. But in general, it's just that not everybody is made equal. And there's no reason why people who don't have the right trait, maybe their salaries will suffer from it, but at least as far as public policy is concerned, they shouldn't be put at a disadvantage. So, for example, if some people will take old age, what do you call it? When you people who say become dependent, Alzheimer and other kind of degeneration. Well, in Israel, you're not the pension system does not include taking out an insurance for that. And then you may say we don't want, and I would very much say we have to be paternalistic about this as well, with a possible opting out like the British system, where you say, well, if you have plenty of money in your account, then maybe you don't have to pay that and you may enjoy whatever money you have now. But by and large, people should be pushed strongly towards having such an insurance because it happens so frequently that people need it. And those who just did not have the foresight will then suffer. And I think that not having the right set of mental traits should not be punished so harshly.
Okay, thank you, David. I think these are very important points. Maybe we should try to close. Any more questions? Anything? Well, in that case, I'd like to thank our presenter here for the, I think, interesting and I think also clear view of what needs to be done. Kind of just as he said, what his age and experience brought him to think that the good system is a balanced system where you have pay as you go and funded. And I think the message for Israel is very, very important, that our pay-as-you-go system is too small, and we cannot rely on the funded system to solve the problems of the poor, of the middle-aged, etc. I think this is a message that we ought to take with us, to think about it, maybe accept it or maybe not, but it's a very important message. So thank you very much for that, Axel, and we wish to hear from you again, and goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, and thank you a lot.
Axel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aviat, for arranging this.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Aviat, for arranging it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, Aviat, you want to say something Just
Actually, I have a
did
general.
we miss something?
No, actually, I have a general question, Axel. Do you think that do you think that there is support? Do we need a formal retirement age in general?
No, but one
Because
is,
you know there is a huge debate in Israel and in general about the retirement age. Do you think that the government should declare a formal retirement age?
I think there ought to be a minimum age in every mandatory pension system, because otherwise, otherwise you can just opt out, and then you undermine the mandatoriness of the system.
Mhm.
So, and obviously, a pay-as-you-go system only works if it's mandatory, because otherwise, again, you can opt out and get the benefits without paying in. So you need a minimum age, and I would, if I look at the accounts in France, then the minimum age is about what they call retirement age, which is very low. You don't need, so let's call it 60 or around that age, right? But you don't need well, you certainly should not have an upper age, right?
Mhm.
Where you are thrown out. That is completely unnecessary unless you are an employer and want to have a pretty costless device to get rid of people. But we know from the American system, where an upper retirement age is illegal, that it also works without one. But otherwise, I'm very much in favor of having a lowest eligibility age, and from there on, you can do what you want. People are so different. Not only as David said, in terms of intellectual abilities, but also in terms of health. And there are people who are very healthy; they can work till 80. There are other people who are unhealthy at age 60, and
Actually, we know from the literature, from the economic literature, that older people do not actually they do not replace the younger people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. Particularly the unions always claim that if the old guys keep working, there will be unemployment for the young guys, which is just simply wrong. All the evidence.
At the end, I spoke about it a lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
The evidence is exactly the opposite.
Yes. Okay. Should we also thank Alex for helping to arrange and organize the things that when it works well, it looks like nobody did anything, but it means somebody worked hard for it. So,
and as we spoke in Tel Aviv, we have many things on the plate to do together. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Axel. Thank you, Martina, and thank you all for joining this meeting.
Yeah, and I hope to eventually see you again in Israel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We'll try. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.